You are sitting in the luxurious cabin of a massive airliner cruising over the Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, the cabin fills with an invisible, toxic gas. You are choking, frantically strapping on a yellow life jacket. In the dark, the plane is plunging toward the black water. But the crash isn't what kills you, because someone on this flight wanted you dead before you ever hit the sea. In the 1950s, air travel was not a chore. It was an absolute luxury. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was considered the grandest passenger in the world. It was a massive, double-decked machine. It featured a spiraling staircase leading down to a private cocktail lounge. Passengers wore expensive suits and elegant evening gowns to fly. They drank champagne while cruising high above the clouds. Pan Am Flight 7 was the crown jewel of this golden era. The aircraft was literally named the Romance of the Skies. On November 8th, the massive plane sat on the runway in San Francisco. It was preparing for a highly routine 9-hour flight to Honolulu, Hawaii. Captain Gordon Brown was in command. He was a seasoned veteran, thousands of hours flying over the open ocean. He knew the Pacific completely. 36 passengers and 8 crew members boarded the aircraft. The doors were sealed tight. The 4 massive propeller engines roared to life, pulling the heavy plane into the sky. For the first half of the journey, everything was flawless. The passengers relaxed in the lounge, entirely, completely isolated from the freezing world outside. At 5:04 p.m., Captain Brown radioed a standard position report to the mainland. His voice was completely calm. He reported clear weather and smooth flying. They were approaching the midway point of the ocean. This is a critical geographical boundary known as the point of no return. Once you cross it, you do not have enough fuel to turn back to California. You must commit to crossing the ocean. Flight 7 crossed the line, and then the timeline shatters. The next mandatory radio check was scheduled at 6:04 p.m. The mainland operator called out to the plane. The radio returned nothing but static. The operator tried again, using different frequencies. Absolute silence. There was no distress call. There was no panicked voice reporting an engine failure. A massive, state-of-the-art airliner had simply vanished from the sky. Within hours, the United States Coast Guard and the Navy launched a massive response. It was the largest aerial and maritime search operation since the Second World War. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and dozens of planes scoured the Pacific. They were looking for an oil slick. They were listening for emergency beacons. They found absolutely. The ocean is incredibly efficient at hiding its dead. Days bled into a week. The families of the 44 victims gathered at airports waiting for a miracle. But the authorities quietly assumed the massive plane had simply exploded in midair. They assumed the wreckage was sitting at the bottom of a freezing abyss. Until day 6, a Navy radar ship was patrolling a completely different sector of the ocean. A sailor looked out over the railing and spotted something bright yellow bobbing in the dark water. It was a life jacket. The ship altered course and moved in. They had found the debris field. It was scattered across miles of churning seawater. The Navy crew lowered small boats and began pulling bodies from the Pacific. They recovered exactly 19 victims. The physical trauma on the bodies indicated a brutal, high-speed impact with the water. The plane had definitely crashed. But the details of the discovery made absolutely no logical sense. First, the location was completely wrong. The bodies were found almost 100 miles entirely off their designated flight path. A veteran pilot like Captain Brown does not drift 100 miles off course by accident. If an engine failed, he would have stayed on the known shipping route to ensure a quick rescue. He intentionally turned the plane away from safety. Why? The second anomaly was even more disturbing. Many of the bodies pulled from the water were wearing yellow life jackets. Some victims even had their seatbelts tightly fastened around their waists. They were completely prepared for a water landing. A mid-air explosion does not give a passenger time to grab a life vest and strap into a seat. This crew knew the plane was going down. They had time to prepare the entire cabin. They had time to hand out vests. They had time to tell the passenger to brace for impact. So why was there no radio call? A distress signal takes less than 3 seconds to transmit, yet the pilots sat in absolute silence as they flew 100 miles in the wrong direction. Cases like this completely defy aviation logic, and if untangling the impossible is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because the coroner was about to find something terrifying hidden inside the victim. The recovered bodies were transported to a military base for official autopsies. Investigators wanted to know exactly how the passengers died. They assumed the cause of death would be blunt force trauma or drowning, but the toxicology reports completely derailed the entire investigation. The coroner found incredibly high levels of carbon monoxide in the victim's blood. Carbon monoxide is a toxic, invisible gas. It has no smell and no taste. It binds to your red blood cell, physically starving your brain of oxygen. The levels in the passenger were lethal. They didn't die from the impact of the crash. They were actively suffocating in their seats long before the plane ever hit the water. This single piece of physical evidence changed everything. Pan Am Flight 7 wasn't just a tragic mechanical failure, it was a flying gas chamber. How does a lethal dose of carbon monoxide flood a pressurized luxury cabin at 20,000 feet? Investigators desperately searched the recovered debris for an answer. Aviation in 1957 did not have black boxes or cockpit voice recording. The physical evidence was all they had. They formulated two distinct, terrifying theories. The first was a catastrophic, completely unpreventable mechanical failure. The Boeing Stratocruiser had a known design flaw with its massive propellers. If a propeller spun out of control, it could snap off the engine. If it detached at high speed, the heavy steel blade could slice directly into the fuselage like a massive knife. A blade slicing through the cabin could easily sever the plane's main radio line. That would perfectly explain the sudden, absolute radio silence. If the blade also ruptured the engine exhausts, toxic carbon monoxide would violently flood the passenger deck. The pilots would be instantly overwhelmed. Carbon monoxide poisoning causes extreme confusion, dizziness, and irrational behavior. It literally breaks your ability to think. If the pilots were suffocated, they might have hallucinated. They might have turned the plane 100 miles off course in a state of pure neurological panic. As the toxic gas filled the cabin, the crew would have frantically handed out life jackets. The passengers would have strapped them on with shaking hands, completely unaware that their own lungs were betraying them. They passed out in their seats before the plane ever touched the wave. It is a deeply horrifying but scientifically plausible scenario. But the FBI believed the truth was much darker. They didn't think it was an accident at all. They looked at the passenger and crew manifests. They discovered a man named Eugene Brown. He was the flight purser. He was essentially the head flight attendant in charge of the luxury cabin. Eugene had a highly troubled personal history. He was in deep financial ruin. He was facing severe legal trouble back on the mainland, and just days before Flight 7 took off, Eugene took out several massive life insurance policies on himself. It was an enormous amount of money. He made sure the paperwork was perfectly finalized before he boarded the plane. Did a desperate man decide to end his own life and take 43 innocent people with him? The FBI investigated the cargo hold vest. They discovered a highly toxic, restricted chemical known as sodium sulfide had been loaded onto the plane. If mixed with acid, it creates a lethal, suffocating gas. Was Eugene smuggling something illegal? Did he intentionally release a chemical agent into the ventilation system to kill the crew? If he flooded the cockpit with gas, the pilots would have been incapacitated in seconds. The plane would have flown aimlessly off course, driven only by the autopilot until the fuel simply ran out. The FBI interviewed Eugene's family and friends. They searched his records, but they could not definitively prove he sabotaged the aircraft. Most of the physical evidence was sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Without the main fuselage, there was no way to prove if a propeller snapped or if a chemical device was detonated. The investigation was completely paralyzed by the deep water. The Civil Aeronautics Board eventually released their final, frustrating report. They officially concluded that the cause of the crash could not be determined. They acknowledged the carbon monoxide in the bodies. They acknowledged the strange location of the wreckage, but they closed the file anyway. The remains of Pan Am Flight 7 were never found. The massive luxury airliner, the cocktail lounge, and the remaining 25 victims are still down there. They are sitting somewhere in a dark, unmapped abyss. The families were left with an agonizing, permanent lack of closure. They had to imagine those final hours over and over, sitting in a luxury cabin, cruising smoothly through the night sky, and then the air simply turning to poison. The terrifying reality of this mystery is the physical action of putting on the life jackets. It requires active, conscious thought. The passengers had to look at each other in the dim light. They had to buckle the straps around their waists. They fully believed they were preparing for a brutal crash landing. They thought the ocean was. They didn't realize the actual threat was completely invisible. They couldn't see it, and they couldn't fight it. They put on their vests. They waited for the water, but the real killer was already inside their lungs.